The gun was in his hand, the door was locked. And Eleanor Marsh had survived 21 days in a room with no windows to end like this in her own kitchen, 1,000 miles from home, with nowhere left to run. She had 1 second to decide. This is the story of the woman who arrived with nothing and refused to leave with less. The blood on Eleanor Marsh's lip had frozen solid by the time she understood what kind of man Douglas Hargrove truly was. But that comes later. First, you need to understand where she began, and to understand that you need to picture a room so small that when she stretched her arms out on cold mornings, her fingers touched both walls. A room above a boarding house on Tremont Street in Boston in the bitter winter of 1885, where the pipes knocked at 3 in the morning and the wind came through the window frame like it had a personal grievance against her. A room that cost $4 a month, which was $4 more than Eleanor could comfortably afford. She was 23 years old, pale skin dusted with light freckles across the bridge of her nose, eyes the color of new leaves in spring, sharp and watchful, the kind of eyes that noticed everything and gave away nothing. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, in dim light, and when she let it down at the end of a long day, it fell in loose waves around her face and shoulders. She kept it pinned up while she worked, which was always because there was always work to be done. Her mother had called those eyes a gift. She used to cup Eleanor's face in her hands and say, "You see through people, Ellie, you always have. It is the rarest thing in the world." Her mother had been wrong about a great many things, but she had not been wrong about that. Eleanor worked as a seamstress. Her fingers were quick and precise, calloused along the tips from years of needlework. She could mend a torn seam in the time it took most women to thread the needle. She could look at a dress and tell you exactly where the construction had failed, exactly what the maker had done wrong, exactly how to fix it. This skill paid her just enough to eat just enough to keep the room and not one penny more. Her father, George Marsh, had died 14 months before this story begins. He had been a decent man with an indecent amount of optimism about the world. He had borrowed $600 to open a small printing business, convinced that Boston needed another printer the way a fire needs more wood. The business lasted 8 months. The debt did not die with him. It transferred itself as debts do to the only living member of the Marsh family who had nothing left to lose. Eleanor had tried to manage it. She had written letters, made arrangements, promised payments. But $600 was not a sum you chipped away at on a seamstress's wages. It was a stone tied around your ankle while you stood at the edge of deep water. 3 days after her father's funeral, her mother had walked to Boston Harbor in the early morning. She had filled the pockets of her gray wool coat with stones from the garden, the smooth, flat ones Eleanor used to collect as a child along the Charles River. The harbor was cold and gray and quiet at that hour. No one saw her go. Eleanor had seen the signs. She had seen her mother sitting at the kitchen table for long hours, not moving, not speaking, just staring at the surface of the wood as though she could see something there that no one else could. She had seen the way her mother stopped eating, stopped answering when spoken to, stopped being present inside her own body, even when she was sitting right beside you. She had seen all of this and had been too consumed by her own grief and fear and exhaustion to understand what she was seeing until it was too late. That was the wound that never closed. Not her father's death, not the debt, not the poverty. It was the knowledge that she had been in the same room with her mother's despair and had failed to reach her. That was the thing that woke Eleanor at 3 in the morning when the pipes were knocking and the wind was finding every crack in the window frame. She had learned slowly and painfully that you could not carry that kind of guilt forever without it becoming something else entirely, something that hollowed you out from the inside. So she had made a choice. She had put the guilt in a box, placed the box in the back of her room in her mind, and closed the door. She was not entirely sure she had locked it. On the evening that everything changed, Eleanor was sitting at her small table by the window, working by lamplight on a hem that a wealthy woman on Commonwealth Avenue needed finished by morning. The city moved outside the glass, dark and cold, indifferent to her in the particular way that cities are indifferent to people who are not yet important. Her mother had kept a tin box under the bed. Eleanor had brought it with her when she left the family home. She had opened it perhaps 100 times in the 14 months since her mother died and had never found anything inside it that gave her comfort. Letters, old photographs, a few newspaper clippings, and at the bottom, tucked beneath everything else, a small stack of printed advertisements torn from papers she did not recognize. Men in the American West seeking companionship. ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, men who wanted wives and wrote about themselves in careful, somewhat desperate language. Respectable man with established property seeks a woman of good character. The advertisements were the kind of thing her mother had apparently collected in private, perhaps for reasons Eleanor would never fully understand, perhaps simply because she had imagined an escape route that she had never taken. Eleanor had read each one more times than she could count. She had written to 5 of the men whose advertisements seemed most legitimate. She had told herself she was not applying for marriage. She was looking for options, which was something different. An option was not a commitment. An option was simply a door left slightly open in a room that was otherwise sealed. 4 of the men had written back with proposals. One had sent a ring. One had included a daguerreotype of himself standing beside a horse with the kind of pride that suggested he thought the horse was the more impressive of the two. The 5th man had written back with something else entirely. His name was James Calloway. He ran a cattle operation called Broken Spur Ranch in the Wyoming Territory. He had lost his wife 7 years prior. He had a 6-year-old daughter named Clara, and what he needed, he wrote in a hand that was plain and unhurried, was someone who could cook for 12 cowboys during the fall roundup season. 2 months of work, $40 wages, room and board included. And then the letter had ended with 3 words that Eleanor read 6 times before she allowed herself to believe them. No other expectations. He had also included something else in the envelope. A small brass key, plain and simple, worn smooth along the bow from handling. A note in the same plain handwriting said, "This is the key to the kitchen at Broken Spur. I am sending it ahead of you so that when you arrive, you will know the place is already waiting for you. Not as a stranger, as someone who belongs there." Eleanor held the key in her palm for a long time. It weighed almost nothing. It was the smallest, most ordinary object she had ever touched. It was the most significant thing anyone had given her in years. She did not think of it as a romantic gesture. She thought of it as a statement of intent. This man had sent her a key before she had agreed to anything, before she had packed a single item, before she had made a single commitment. He had sent it because he wanted her to feel from the first moment that she was not walking into someone else's territory. He was telling her in the plainest possible language that she would have access, that she would not be locked out. She put the key in the pocket of her work dress. She wrote back the same evening and said she would take the job. She had $87 in savings. She bought a train ticket west with enough left over for food along the way. She packed 1 carpet bag with everything that mattered. On the morning she left, her landlady on Tremont Street pressed a folded newspaper clipping into her hand at the door. "Thought you might have seen this," the woman said, "given that you're going out that direction." Eleanor unfolded the clipping on the street outside. It was a notice from the Boston Evening Transcript, several months old. Anna Doyle, 24 years of age. Left Boston in March bound for Wyoming Territory in response to a situation offered by correspondence. Family has received no word. Anyone with information is asked to contact. Eleanor read it twice. Then she tucked it into her carpet bag and walked toward the train station, telling herself it was a coincidence, the way you tell yourself things you are not yet ready to examine. She did not know then that Anna Doyle was already dead. She did not know then that Anna Doyle's name was written in a ledger in a house she would one day be taken to against her will. She did not know any of that. She only knew she had a key in her pocket and a train ticket to Wyoming and nowhere else on earth to go. The journey west took the better part of 2 weeks. Boston to Chicago consumed 3 days. She watched New England give way to the flat certainty of the Midwest through a window streaked with coal smoke and condensation. She ate bread and hard cheese she had brought her from the city and drank the weak coffee they sold at station stops and tried not to think too much about what she was doing. In Chicago, she waited 6 hours for the connecting train. She sat on a bench in the great noisy hall of Union Station and watched the crowds move past and felt for the first time in a long time something that was almost excitement, not happiness, not relief, something more cautious than either of those. A sense that the weight of Boston, the accumulated grief and debt in small airless room, was beginning to lift slightly the way low clouds sometimes lift on a winter morning to reveal that the sky above them was blue and clear all along. The train from Chicago to Omaha took 4 more days. Eleanor shared her bench for part of the journey with a widow named Helen Crawford, who was traveling to Denver to live with her daughter. Helen was a woman who had been made sharp by hard years and spoke plainly about most things. The West is nothing like the advertisements, Helen said on the second day, looking out the window at the prairie rolling past in brown and gold. The men are harder. The winters are harder. You will work until your hands bleed, and you will still barely stay ahead of what the land takes from you. That sounds like Boston, Eleanor said. Helen looked at her with something between respect and amusement. The difference is that out there, nobody cares who your father was or what debts he left behind. They care what you can do. They care what you are willing to carry. She paused. Some women find that liberating. Some find it terrifying. I'm hoping for the first one, Eleanor said. Helen Crawford smiled, which was apparently a rare thing. Then you might be all right. She arrived in Omaha on a gray Thursday afternoon with one carpet bag, the brass key in her pocket, and a connecting ticket to Cheyenne that departed at 6 o'clock the following morning. She had one night in Omaha. She planned to find a meal, find a bed, and be on the train at dawn. She never made it to Cheyenne. She was standing on the platform in the late afternoon light, watching her bags when a man approached her with the particular confidence of someone who has decided the approach is already successful. He was tall, broad through the shoulders. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples in a way that might have been distinguished if his eyes had been different. He wore a cattleman's coat, good boots, and the kind of careful, pressed respectability that takes time and money to maintain. He was smiling. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Eleanor Marsh, bound for Wyoming." She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not yet. Something quieter and more immediate. An internal stillness, the way water goes still just before the cold gets deep enough to freeze it. "Yes," she said carefully. "How do you know my name?" "James Calloway sent me," he said. "Change of plans, I'm afraid. He's dealing with some trouble at the ranch cattle situation, couldn't get away. He asked me to bring you out the rest of the way. I'm a neighbor of his, Douglas Hargrove. My place is just north of Broken Spur." He extended his hand. "It's a pleasure, Miss Marsh." She had $87 in savings minus the train ticket. She had one carpet bag and one night in a strange city. She had no one in Omaha she could call on, no one to ask, no way to verify a single word this man had said. She took his hand. His grip was exactly 2 seconds too long and exactly 15 pounds too firm. These were the kinds of details she noticed and then immediately argued herself out of noticing, because she needed this to work, because there was no version of the story where she turned around and went back to Boston, because the alternative was a small, airless room on Tremont Street and a debt she could not outrun, and a locked box at the back of a room in her mind that she could feel straining at its hinges. She told herself she was being foolish. Suspicious of kindness because she had known so little of it. She was not being foolish. Douglas Hargrove helped her with her carpet bag and led her to a wagon waiting outside the station. She climbed up, and they pulled into the Omaha streets in the gray afternoon light, and she watched the city thin out into the eastern edge of the Great American Plains, and she thought, this is it. This is the beginning of the thing you came for. The first sign that something was wrong came 40 minutes later when it became clear they were not heading toward Cheyenne. Hargrove explained this with smooth patience. A more direct route, better road conditions, less time in the saddle. The logic was plausible enough if you didn't think about it too carefully, and Eleanor, exhausted and relieved to be met at all, chose not to think about it too carefully. The second sign came when they arrived not at a prosperous cattle ranch, but at a homestead that looked like it had been losing an argument with the Wyoming wind for 30 years. The fences sagged. The house leaned to one side like a man who had been drinking since morning. The barn roof had holes through which the sky was clearly visible. In the small corral, 6 cattle stood with their ribs showing through their hides. This was nothing like the ranch James Calloway had described in his letter. This was nothing like the kind of place a man would send a key ahead to make someone feel welcome. "This isn't Broken Spur," she said. Her voice was flat and careful. Douglas Hargrove stepped down from the wagon. The smile was still on his face, but something had changed in his eyes the way a light changes when you move a shade across it. It was still there, but it was coming from a different direction entirely. "No," he said. "This is Hargrove Ranch, and you are going to be my wife." He produced a document from inside his coat. "A marriage contract," he said, with her signature at the bottom. The writing looked like hers. the loops and careful curves of her capital letters, the particular slant she gave to the letter M in Marsh. She had never seen this document before in her life. "I never signed this," she said. She stepped backward toward the wagon. "This is a mistake. I need to get to Broken Spur Ranch." He stepped between her and the wagon. The pleasant expression was gone entirely now. In its place was something she would later spend a great deal of effort trying to describe to a sheriff and a jury in a courtroom full of strangers. There was no anger in his face. Anger would have been almost reassuring. What she saw instead was the expression of a man checking something off a list. The expression of a man performing a task he had performed before and expected to perform again without significant complication. "There is no mistake," he said. "I paid good money for that train ticket, and I had your name signed on that contract real careful. As far as anyone in Wyoming territory knows, you came here willing. You try to leave, I'll have the law drag you back for breach of contract and theft of the passage cost." She ran. She made it 8 feet. He caught her before she reached the wheel of the wagon and carried her into the house while she screamed. There was no one to hear. The nearest neighbor was 7 miles east, and the wind was coming from the west, and the sky over Wyoming was enormous and indifferent in the way that skies are when human suffering is taking place beneath them. He put her in a room at the back of the house and turned the key in the lock. She beat on the door until her hands were bruised and swollen. Then she stopped beating on the door and stood in the center of that small dark room and breathed. Then she sat down on the floor and put her hand in her pocket and found the brass key James Calloway had sent her from Broken Spur Ranch. She held it in the dark. It weighed almost nothing. It was smooth along the bow from handling. She did not let go of it. The days in that room became a week. The week became 2. She learned the rhythms of the house the way a prisoner learns the rhythms of a jail, because rhythm is information and information is survival. Hargrove left for days at a time, heading to Cheyenne or Laramie to play cards, to run whatever schemes kept a man like him operational. When he was gone, the house was quieter but not safer, because the lock on the door was still turned and the window was nailed shut. When he was home, the evenings were the worst of it. She learned to go very still and very quiet during those times. She learned to send her mind somewhere else entirely, to stand in the kitchen at Broken Spur Ranch, a kitchen she had never seen, and feel the morning light coming through east-facing windows, and hear the sound of coffee boiling on a cast-iron stove, and hold the brass key in her hand, while some other part of her, the part that lived in her body and could not go anywhere, endured what needed to be endured. She thought, "I will survive this. I will get out. And when I get out, I will not run. I will do something about this." She did not know yet what that something was. The boy who brought her meals was 14 years old. His name was Thomas. He had his father's dark hair and nothing else of his father in him that she could see. He had old eyes, the kind of eyes that children develop when they are exposed too early to things they should not have to understand. He slid her food under the door on a tin plate and stood outside in the hall for a moment each time before he walked away. On the 4th day, she spoke to him through the door. "Thomas, that is your name, isn't it?" A pause. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Eleanor. You can call me Ellie if you'd like." Another pause. "All right. How long have you lived here?" A longer pause this time. "All my life," he said. "And then my mother is buried out back, and 2 others. She pressed her hand flat against the door. "Thomas, Father says they left, that they got tired of ranch life and moved on." His voice was flat and strange, the voice of someone reciting something they stopped believing a long time ago. "But I was 8 when my mother died. I remember hearing her." He walked away before she could respond. The next day, when he brought her food again, she asked him to wait. "The window in here," she said. "Is it nailed from outside or inside?" "Outside," he said. "The lock on this door, is it a standard lever lock or something more complex?" A very long pause. "Standard." She felt inside her hair for the pins. She had 3 left. "Thomas, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whatever your father does after I am gone, none of this is your fault. You didn't make any of this happen." "I know," he said quietly. "Do you, Craig?" "No," he said. "Not really." She worked on the lock at night using the hairpins. She had watched a pickpocket in Boston do it once years ago, and she had the kind of memory that retained things like that, precise mechanical information filed away alongside dress construction and hem measurements in the particular way her mother had smiled before everything went wrong. The lock yielded on the second night. She was not ready. She put the pin back in her hair, relocked the door from inside, and spent the next 9 days planning. She mapped the house from sounds. She memorized Hargrove's schedule. She identified which floorboards creaked and approximately where. She rationed the small amount of money she had managed to conceal in the hem of her dress, $2 she had extracted over 3 weeks from loose coins she found when Hargrove was drunk enough not to notice anything missing. On the ninth night, she found something else. She had been given limited access to the kitchen during the day, supervised cooking and cleaning as Hargrove demanded. On one such afternoon, he left suddenly for the barn and forgot to lock the pantry cabinet where he kept certain documents. Eleanor moved quickly. She had perhaps 4 minutes. She found what she expected to find, her forged contract copies of documents relating to the land correspondence. She memorized what she could. But at the very bottom of the stack, she found something she had not expected. A letter written in a different hand entirely addressed to D.H. in abbreviation, signed by the name Frederick Aldrich. The letter was short. She read it twice. D.H. The Calloway situation remains unresolved. I need that ranch in hand before spring. The water rights alone are worth more than everything you have put together. I am paying you to ensure the Marshwoman does not reach Broken Spur. Handle it, and the arrangement continues as discussed. F.A. She stood in that pantry with the letter in her hands and understood something with a cold and absolute clarity. She had not been intercepted by accident. Douglas Hargrove had not simply been a predator who happened to be at the Omaha station at the right time. He had been paid to intercept her. Someone had known she was coming, known her name, known her route, and had arranged for her to disappear before she reached James Calloway's ranch. She heard the barn door. She had perhaps 30 seconds. She replaced the other documents exactly as she had found them. She folded the letter from Aldrich and placed it inside her dress flat against her skin. Then she closed the cabinet and was standing at the kitchen counter with her hands in the flour when Hargrove came back through the door. He looked at her. She looked at the flour. He poured himself a drink and sat down, and she continued cooking, and he never knew. She spent 3 more days waiting, not because she needed more time to prepare, because she needed him drunk enough that she was confident of the margin of error. On the 21st night, Douglas Hargrove came home from Cheyenne at 10 in the evening with enough whiskey in him that he walked into the kitchen door frame on his way to the back of the house. She heard him hit the floor at 11:15. The snoring began before midnight. She waited 2 more hours. At 2 in the morning, she took the hairpin from her hair and put it in the lock and worked it with the slow, precise movements of someone who had practiced this in the dark for many hours over many days. The mechanism turned. The door opened. She stepped into the hall. The house was dark and stilled except for the sound of Hargrove breathing in the kitchen. Thick and irregular, the breathing of someone who had gone somewhere they would not be easily recalled from. She moved toward the front door. Thomas was standing in the parlor. She went absolutely still. He was dressed, which meant he had not been sleeping. He stood in the center of the small room with his arms at his sides and looked at her with those old tired eyes, and she waited for him to shout for his father, and she prepared herself to run, regardless of what happened next. He did not shout. East, he said very quietly. Head east toward Cedar Falls. There's a town there. Stay off the main road. Father knows the man at the checkpoint. She stared at him. He'll know you let me go. I know. Thomas. I'm tired, he said. He said it simply without drama, the way you say something that has been true for a very long time. I'm tired of watching people get buried. That line, those exact words, she would carry them with her for the rest of her life. She wanted to take them with her. He shook his head before she could ask. I have to stay. Someone has to be here. Someone has to remember. A pause. Go now, before he wakes. She left. She walked out the front door of Hargrove Ranch into the cold Wyoming night, and she walked east, and she did not look back. Not once, not even when the house disappeared behind the first rise of ground and became just a dark shape against the darker sky. She walked through the night following the stars. She hid in an abandoned barn through the daylight hours, sleeping in shallow, fearful fragments on a bed of old hay. The second day, she found a stream and drank until her stomach ached. She found wild berries growing in the shadows along the bank and ate them without knowing whether they were safe, because the alternative was not eating, and not eating was a slower version of the same danger. On the second evening, a wagon found her on the side of the road. An old German farmer, wide-shouldered and quiet, who looked at her with eyes that had seen enough of the world not to need explanations. He gave her water and bread and a place on the bench seat and asked nothing about where she had come from or what had happened to her. He drove her to Cedar Falls and let her down in front of a boarding house with a hand on the brim of his hat. "Whatever you are running from," he said in his careful, accented English, "I hope it runs slower than you." She looked down at herself. The black Victorian dress was torn at the shoulder, mud-stained from the knees down the high lace collar, dark with grime. Her hair was loose and wild around her face. She had $2.09 and a brass key in one pocket and a letter that could destroy a powerful man in the other. "So far," she said, "everything has." He smiled and drove away. Cedar Falls in the last light of afternoon was small and dusty and entirely uninterested in the arrival of one more damaged woman heading west. She walked along the main street and felt the eyes of strangers moving over her with the particular assessment people apply to someone who is clearly in trouble, evaluating whether the trouble is contagious before deciding whether to get closer or further away. She was passing the boarding house when a woman's voice stopped her. "You are bleeding on my porch." The woman in the doorway was perhaps 55, gray-haired, with a face that the Wyoming wind had worked over for decades into something that looked like carved wood. She had the expression of someone who had seen enough hard things to have stopped being surprised by them and started simply cataloging them. "I apologize," Eleanor said. Her lip had split open again at some point. "I'll move along." "Where are you headed?" "Broken Spur Ranch. I have business with the owner." Something shifted in the woman's face. "James Calloway. What kind of business?" "Employment. I wrote to him from Boston about a position, cooking for his roundup crew." A pause. "You're the woman he was expecting 3 weeks ago." Eleanor's chest tightened. "He was expecting me. The letter was real. He received word that you'd changed your mind, married someone in Omaha instead." The woman studied her with clear, steady eyes. "He wasn't pleased about it." "I never wrote that letter." The woman stepped back from the door and made a gesture that was not quite an invitation and not quite a command, but something that combined the two effectively. "Come inside. My name is Ruth Hensley. I've known James Calloway for 15 years. And whoever you are and whatever happened to you, you are not going anywhere looking like that." Eleanor followed her inside. The boarding house was plain and clean, lace curtains, a parlor with worn furniture, the smell of bread somewhere in the back of the building. Ruth sat her down at a kitchen table and produced coffee and cold chicken and bread and watched her eat with the focused attention of someone assessing a situation. "Douglas Hargrove," Ruth said when Eleanor had finished speaking. She had listened without interruption, which was rarer than it should have been. "I know of him. Everyone within 40 miles knows of him. He's careful. Always papers. Always a story that holds together if you don't look too close." She set down her coffee cup. "There are graves behind his house, 3 of them. People have talked about it for years, but no one has ever gone to look." "I know," Eleanor said. "I saw them from the window." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something about James before you go up there. He is a good man, a fair man, but he is not an easy one. He lost his wife when Clara was born 7 years ago. Difficult birth, February blizzard, doctor couldn't get through in time. He has not trusted easily since then. And a woman arriving with a story about being held captive and a 3-week delay and a letter he never sent that is going to require more than your word." "I have his letter," Eleanor said. "The original, the one offering me the position. I've carried it since Boston." "That helps, but it doesn't explain the letter he received saying you'd married someone else." "I know." Eleanor put her hands flat on the table. They were steady. She had made them steady through deliberate effort. "I also have something else." She reached inside her dress and produced the letter from Frederick Aldrich. Ruth Hensley read it twice. Then she sat very still for a moment, with the letter in her hands and the expression of someone assembling a puzzle they had been working on for a long time without the piece that would make the picture clear. "Frederick Aldrich," she said. "You know that name too." "The banker from Cheyenne. He has been trying to buy up land along Broken Creek for 2 years, offering prices that are low enough to be insulting and then offering them again a few months later when things get harder." She looked up. "James has refused him 3 times that I know of." Then this, Eleanor said, is why I was never supposed to arrive. The silence in Ruth Hensley's kitchen was the kind that happens when two people simultaneously understand something complicated and are each giving the other time to catch up. You need to clean yourself up, Ruth said finally. I have clothes that belong to my daughter. She is in California now. They will fit you. You cannot walk up to James Calloway's door looking like something the prairie sent back. She spent 20 minutes at the wash basin cleaning away 2 days of road and fear. She changed into a borrowed dress, gray cotton plain but whole. She combed her dark hair back into order. In the small mirror above the basin, she looked at herself for the first time in 3 weeks and found she was still there, which was not the certainty it sounds like. There are ways to lose yourself in a bad situation that don't leave visible marks. When she came back downstairs, Ruth pressed something into her hand, an extra $2 folded small. Don't argue, the older woman said, and don't thank me either. Just go. Eleanor walked the 6 miles to Broken Spur Ranch in the late afternoon, and she did not take Ruth's offered horse because she needed the walk, needed the ground solid beneath her feet, needed to feel the distance close with each step rather than being carried over it. The Wyoming landscape opened up around her as she went rolling grassland, stretching toward mountains that were purple and hazy at that distance, hawks circling in long, slow arcs against the enormous sky. It was a country that was entirely indifferent to whether you made it or not, which Eleanor found to her own surprise deeply comforting. She had been living for months in a city that was also indifferent to whether she made it. At least out here, the indifference had a certain grandeur. Broken Spur Ranch appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, then gathered itself into shapes and details as she approached. A house built to last 2 stories, real glass in the windows, a wide covered porch. A barn with fresh red paint. Corrals where healthy horses moved with the contained energy of animals well-fed and well-kept. Fences running straight and true across the landscape. Everything here had been put in place, deliberately maintained with intention, kept up by someone who believed the place was worth keeping. She climbed the porch steps and knocked. The door opened, and James Calloway looked down at her. He was taller than she had imagined from the letter. 6 feet and change broad through the shoulders with the lean, hard build of someone who worked cattle every day of his life. Dark brown hair cut short, a neatly trimmed full beard. He wore a light blue chambray shirt under a tan leather vest and a wide-brimmed black hat he had not removed, which meant he had been heading somewhere when she knocked. His eyes were gray. Not the gentle silver gray of winter clouds, but the sharp, flat gray of the sky right before a storm hits, when the color has been wrung out of everything and what is left is purely functional. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately categorize. Not unkind, not welcoming. Help you, he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. The voice of someone who had learned long ago that the world could wait for what he had to say. Eleanor squared her shoulders. She had walked 6 miles and survived 3 weeks and carried a letter from a dead woman's name in her pocket, and she was not going to waste any of that now. Mr. Calloway, she said, my name is Eleanor Marsh. I'm here about the position you offered, cook and housekeeper for roundup season. Something crossed his face. Surprise first, then suspicion moving in behind it like weather. You're 3 weeks late, he said, and you sent a letter saying you'd married someone in Omaha. I never sent that letter. I was intercepted in Omaha by a man named Douglas Hargrove, who told me he was your associate, that you'd sent him to collect me. He took me to his property under false pretenses. I was held there against my will for 3 weeks. I escaped 2 days ago. James Calloway said nothing. He looked at her with those storm gray eyes, and she looked back, and neither of them moved. I have your original letter, she said, the one offering me the position. I've carried it with me since Boston. She reached into her dress pocket, found it, and held it out. He took it, read it, looked up. This doesn't prove you didn't change your mind and choose Hargrove instead. No, she said, it doesn't. She reached into her other pocket, the one close to her heart, and produced the letter from Frederick Aldrich. But this does. He read it. She watched his face and saw the same thing happen that she had seen happen on Ruth Hensley's face, that assembling of pieces, that quiet and dangerous clarity arriving. When he looked up, his eyes were different, still guarded, But something had shifted in the quality of the guardedness, the way a door shifts when the latch has been moved, not open yet, but no longer locked in the same way. "You found this at Hargrove's property," he said. "In the document cabinet. I had approximately 4 minutes. And you kept it." "I kept it because I understood what it meant, even before I knew what I was going to do with it." He studied her for another long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Walt," he called into the house. A man appeared from somewhere in the back, perhaps 58 years old, leather-faced, blue-eyed, walking with the permanent bow-leg gait of a man who had spent the majority of his years on horseback. He took Eleanor in with one comprehensive look that missed nothing, and then raised an eyebrow at James. "This is Eleanor Marsh," James said. "She'll be cooking for Roundup. Show her the kitchen and get her settled." "Yes, boss." Walt turned to Eleanor with a small nod. "Ma'am, Walter Briggs, ranch foreman." "A beat. You look like you've been through some kind of difficulty." "You could say that," Eleanor said. "I generally do say what I mean," Walt said. He started toward the side of the house. "Kitchen's this way." Eleanor followed him. After 2 steps, she stopped and turned back. James was still standing in the doorway, the Aldrich letter in his hand, watching her. She met his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't started the work." She turned and followed Walt toward the kitchen, and as she walked, she put her hand in her pocket and felt the brass key still there, worn smooth from 3 weeks of being held in the dark. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not yet know how hard it would be to stay there. That night, lying in the small, clean loft above the bunkhouse, listening to the sounds of broken spur ranch settling into the dark, Eleanor Marsh finally let herself be still. The first time in 3 weeks. The horses in the barn, the low murmur of cowboys on the bunkhouse porch. Somewhere far off, a coyote doing its work against the enormous Wyoming sky. For a moment, it felt like safety. Then came the sound of hoofbeats from the west. Fast, purposeful. Walt's voice cutting through the night from somewhere across the yard. "Boss, rider coming in from Hargrove's direction." Moving hard, Eleanor sat straight up in the dark. She put her hand in her pocket. The key was still there. Douglas Hargrove rode into the yard of Broken Spur Ranch at 11 minutes past midnight, and he did not come quietly. Eleanor heard him from the bunkhouse loft before she saw him, the hard rhythm of hoofbeats against dry ground, the particular urgency of a horse being pushed faster than it wanted to go in the dark. She was already at the window when the rider came into the circle of light thrown by the lantern Walt had hung on the corral post. And even at that distance, even in that poor light, she knew him. The width of the shoulders, the way he sat a horse like he owned not just the animal, but everything the animal could see. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window and made herself breathe. Below, the ranch had already come awake. James stood on the porch with a rifle cradled in the crook of his left arm, as naturally as another man might hold a walking stick. Walt materialized from the shadows near the barn, with his revolver already drawn. The bunkhouse door opened, and men came out in ones and twos, buckles still being fastened, but all of them armed, all of them oriented toward the approaching rider with the focused, unhurried readiness of people who had spent their lives in country where danger arrived without announcement and survival depended on not being surprised by it. 12 men against 1. Hargrove pulled his horse to a hard stop 20 feet from the porch, and the animal threw its head and stamped. And he let it because he was looking at James, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has not yet accepted that a situation has moved beyond his control. "That is my wife you have in there, Calloway." James said nothing for a moment. The silence was deliberate, the way certain silences are deliberate, the way a man will pause before speaking, simply to establish that he is not in any hurry and therefore holds the upper hand. When he did speak, his voice carried no heat at all. "I have a cook," he said. "Nothing more. She signed a contract. She owes me $200 for the train passage and 3 weeks room and board. She is legally bound to me, and I am here to collect what is mine. Show me the contract." Hargrove reached inside his coat and threw a folded document to the ground between them, the gesture of a man accustomed to documents being his most reliable weapon. James descended the porch steps without hurry, picked it up, unfolded it, and held it up to the light from the doorway. Eleanor watched from the window, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, where her heartbeat was doing things she did not have words for. James studied the document. Then he looked up. This signature is forged. The hell it is. Eleanor Marsh never signed this. I have samples of her handwriting from the correspondence we exchanged. The construction of the letters is close, but not identical. The pressure is wrong. He folded the document with deliberate care and held it in his right hand. I am going to take this to a handwriting examiner in Cheyenne. And while I am doing that, I will also be speaking with Sheriff Reed about 3 graves behind your property, Douglas. Unmarked ones. The kind a man digs when he does not want anyone asking questions about who is in them. What happened to Hargrove's face in that moment was not fear exactly. It was something more involuntary than fear. The physical response of a system encountering a threat it had been quietly dreading for a long time. A tightening along the jaw. A stillness in the eyes that was different from the stillness of confidence. He recovered in under 2 seconds. She has been lying to you. She came to me willing and changed her mind, and now she is telling stories to cover it. Then you won't mind Sheriff Reed having a look around your property. Hargrove's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. The movement was perhaps a quarter complete when every man in the yard had a weapon pointed at him. The sound of hammers being drawn back was a series of small, precise clicks in the night air like a clock ticking through its final seconds. He went very still. Walt spoke from the shadows, his voice carrying the particular quiet of a man who has not yet decided whether to be patient. I would not finish that thought, he said, unless you want to find out whether you are faster than all of us combined. I will save you the trouble of wondering. You are not. The hand moved away from the gun with careful, deliberate slowness. This is not over, Hargrove said. His voice was controlled again, the clinical surface restored. He looked up at the bunkhouse window, and Eleanor pulled back from the glass, though she was nearly certain the loft was too dark for him to see her. That woman owes me. I will take this to the territorial court if I have to. I will make what she has told you look like the desperate story it is. Try it, James said, and when you do, bring something better than a forged signature, because the court is going to be a great deal more interested in those graves than in your paperwork. For a long moment, Hargrove sat his horse and looked at James, and James looked back, and the night held its breath around both of them. Then Hargrove turned his animal and spurred it and rode back into the darkness, the way he had come, the sound of hoofbeats diminishing until they became nothing against the vast Wyoming silence. Nobody moved for the space of perhaps 30 seconds. Then Walt lowered his revolver and exhaled slowly, the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding for longer than was comfortable. Well, he said to no one in particular, that was an interesting way to end an evening. Post a watch, James said. 2-man rotations. I want someone on the west perimeter until further notice. He looked up at the bunkhouse window, and this time Eleanor was certain he could see her, or at least certain he was looking at exactly the right place. Miss Marsh, my office, now. She climbed down from the loft and crossed the yard in the cool night air, and followed him through the parlor into the small room at the back of the house lined with shelves of account books and ledgers, a desk covered in papers, a single lamp that threw warm yellow light across the ceiling. He closed the door. He stood for a moment with his back to her, his hands on the edge of the desk looking at the surface. Then he turned. Tell me everything, he said, from the beginning. Leave nothing out. So she did. She told him about Boston and the debt and her mother and the box of advertisements. She told him about the train and the Omaha platform and Hargrove's approach, and she watched James's jaw tighten at the part about the forged contract and his hands go still at the part about the locked room. She told him about the 3 graves and what Thomas had told her through the door. She told him about the letter in the pantry cabinet, the name Frederick Aldrich, the 4 minutes she had to read it and decide what to do with it. She told him about the 21 days and the hairpin and Thomas in the parlor at 2 in the morning, saying he was tired of watching people get buried. James listened. He was one of those people who listen with their whole body, not nodding or making sounds to indicate attention, just perfectly still and fully present in a way that most people cannot sustain for 30 seconds, let alone 30 minutes. When she finished, the lamp guttered slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows in the room shifted and settled. I believe you, he said. Eleanor felt something in her chest release with an almost physical sensation like a fist unclenching that had been closed for a very long time. The letter from Aldrich, James continued. He picked it up from where she had placed it on the desk. I have been trying to understand why someone would go to this kind of trouble over a piece of land, over water rights. He looked at the letter. Broken Creek runs through the eastern edge of my property. It is the only reliable water source for 11 miles in either direction. If someone controlled that, they could charge every rancher in this valley whatever they wanted for access. It would be worth more than the land itself. Aldrich knew you would not sell, Eleanor said. He made 3 offers. The last one was so far below market value that I thought he was joking. James set the letter down. I did not consider that refusing might make me a target for something more systematic. He is not patient, Eleanor said. He is methodical. There is a difference. Patient men wait for things to change. Methodical men change things. James looked at her. It was the kind of look that takes a moment to fully arrive, not the surface assessment of a stranger, but something more deliberate, the look of a person revising an understanding they thought was already complete. Tomorrow morning, he said, we go to town. We speak to Sheriff Reed. We put everything on record before Hargrove has time to construct whatever story he is going to construct next. He paused. Reed is a decent man, former detective from Chicago. He is one of the few people in this county who does not owe Frederick Aldrich a favor specifically because he has been careful his entire career not to borrow money from people he might one day have to investigate. 60 days, Eleanor said. James looked at her. Sheriff Reed told me when I came through Cedar Falls, if charges are brought, the trial requires 60 days a minimum to arrange. If I am not available to testify, Hargrove walks for lack of direct witness. She met his eyes steadily. He is going to spend those 60 days trying to make me disappear. James was quiet for a moment. Then we make sure he does not succeed. The next morning was gray and cold and smelled of coming rain. They rode to Cedar Falls in James's wagon, Eleanor on the bench seat beside him, the 2 horses pulling through the pale early light, while the ranch fell away behind them and the Wyoming plains stretched ahead in every direction with their enormous unhurried indifference. James did not make conversation on the journey, which Eleanor found she did not mind. There is a kind of silence that is the absence of something, and there is a kind of silence that is a presence in itself, a thing with weight and texture, and the silence between them on that wagon was the second kind. She watched the hawks. He watched the road. They arrived in Cedar Falls as the town was beginning its morning. Sheriff Thomas Reed was a large man who had gone soft in the middle, in the way that large men sometimes do when the years of hard physical work are behind them and the years of desk work have begun. His hair was iron gray. His face was the face of someone who had seen a great many things and had developed the habit of looking at new situations calmly, because the habit of alarm had proven over time to produce worse outcomes than the habit of consideration. He listened to Eleanor for the better part of an hour. He asked precise questions at precise moments, never interrupting her account, but inserting questions between natural pauses, like a man inserting pins into a map to mark significant locations. When she produced the Aldrich letter, he read it 3 times and then set it on his desk and placed one finger on it with the deliberate care of a man placing a marker on something valuable. Frederick Aldrich, he said. You know the name, James said. Everyone who has had occasion to look carefully at land transactions in this county over the past 4 years knows the name. He operates legally. That is the difficulty. He finds properties under financial pressure, offers below-market purchase, creates or accelerates conditions that increase that pressure, and then makes the same offer again when the owner is more vulnerable. Reed looked at the letter. Using Hargrove as an instrument to remove a witness before she could arrive and create complications is consistent with his methods, more aggressive than his usual approach, but consistent. The Graves, Eleanor said, the 3 women at Hargrove's property. I'm going out there today, Reed said. He looked at Eleanor with the straight, undecorated gaze of a man who respects the person he is speaking to enough not to soften what he is about to say. Miss Marsh, I want you to understand what the next 60 days are likely to involve. Hargrove will file a counter-complaint within the week. He will claim the contract is legitimate, that you left voluntarily, that anything you experienced was the consequence of your own choices. He will attempt to damage your credibility by every available means. And Aldrich, if he believes we are moving toward him, will use his resources to complicate matters in ways that are difficult to anticipate. I understand, Eleanor said. You're sure? I have been sure of very little in the past several weeks, Sheriff, but I am sure of this. She kept her hand still in her lap. I am not going anywhere. Reed nodded once with the economy of a man who does not waste gestures. Stay at Broken Spur. I will send word when I have been out to Hargrove's property. A pause. James, watch your land, all of it. On the way out of Reed's office, they encountered a woman coming up the steps with a doctor's bag and the brisk forward energy of someone who has a great many things to do and has allocated time for none of them individually. She stopped when she saw James. Calloway, I was going to ride out to your place this afternoon. Maggie, James touched his hat. This is Eleanor Marsh. She'll be cooking for Roundup. Eleanor Dr. Margaret Foster, veterinarian and the nearest thing to a physician this town has. Dr. Foster was 35, with fair hair gone warm brown at the roots and hands that showed considerable work, and eyes that evaluated things with the same calm efficiency she presumably brought to the diagnosis of sick animals. She looked at Eleanor's face, at the fading marks along her jaw, and the careful way she was holding her body, and made a small sound that was not quite a word, but contained within it the complete understanding of a woman who has seen this particular kind of damage before and is not in the habit of pretending it is something else. Come inside, she said, both of you. What I have to tell James is something you should hear as well. In her small office, she examined Eleanor thoroughly and wrote up a medical report documenting the injuries with the precise clinical language that would be useful in a courtroom and useless nowhere else. While she worked, she spoke to James about the cattle. 20 head dead in the past 3 months. She had been examining each carcass brought to her attention, and the pattern had become unmistakable. Dilated pupils, jaw rigidity, the characteristic green-black discoloration of stomach contents. Classic presentation of strychnine poisoning delivered through the salt blocks the cattle licked in the north pasture. Someone was dissolving the poison in water and pouring it over the blocks at night, where it dried invisibly and waited. Someone with money, she said, pressing carefully along Eleanor's ribs. Strychnine in those quantities costs real money. Buying it from pharmacies requires signing for it. There will be records somewhere. Eleanor reached inside her dress and produced the letter from Aldrich. I found this at Hargrove's property 3 weeks ago, she said. I think the person buying the strychnine and the person who wrote this letter are the same person. Maggie Foster read the letter with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Then she looked up. Frederick Aldrich has been in Cedar Falls twice in the past 6 months. Once to speak with the bank and once for what he described as a property consultation. I remember him because he is the kind of man who takes up more space in a room than his physical size would suggest. She returned the letter to Eleanor. I will check the pharmacy records in Cedar Falls and Cheyenne both. If he bought strychnine in the quantities needed for this, his name will be on a receipt. Frederick Aldrich, James said for the 3rd time that morning. He said it the way you say a name when you are committing it to a different and more serious category of memory. He never showed his hand directly. Methodical men rarely do, Eleanor said. Both James and Maggie looked at her. She had not meant to say it aloud, but neither of them looked as though they disagreed. The next morning, Roundup began. Eleanor woke before 5 in the darkness of the bunkhouse loft and came down the ladder and crossed the yard to the kitchen in the pre-dawn cold, her breath making small clouds in the air, and she lit the stove and put the coffee on and began on breakfast for 12 men who would be in the saddle from first light until they could no longer see. The work of the kitchen was familiar in a way that surprised her. She had cooked at the Tremont Street boarding house for 2 years, breakfast and dinner and supper every day for 50 residents, and the arithmetic was not so different here. More meat, more biscuits, coffee that could, as Walt told her on that first morning with complete seriousness, float a horseshoe. She found the rhythms of it within the first hour and settled into them the way you settle into a stride when the road is good and the distance ahead is manageable. The cowboys came in from the bunkhouse in the gray pre-dawn light, stomping dust from their boots, filling the long table in a series of waves. They were a rough assembly of ages and temperaments and degrees of verbal communication. Eddie, large and red-bearded, whose appetite was a kind of personal achievement he seemed quietly proud of. Pete, barely 18, with the hollow-legged hunger of someone still finishing the project of becoming fully grown. Samuel, the oldest after Walt, with a deeply scarred face and hands that turned out to be surprisingly careful with dishes. Young men and older men, and men somewhere in between who had made the West their permanent address and wore it in the way they moved and spoke and looked at things. They tested her as people in any new arrangement test the newest element. They requested things that were complicated. They left the kitchen in states that required significant remediation. They made the kinds of comments to each other that were designed to be overheard and assessed for reaction. She did not react. She cooked what they requested if she had the ingredients. She cleaned what they made messy without comment. She mended 3 shirts and a pair of chaps on the second evening without being asked, leaving them folded on the appropriate bunks. By the 4th morning, Eddie was carrying water for her before she had to think about asking. Pete was splitting firewood and stacking it by the back door. Samuel was washing dishes after dinner with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided a task is worth doing and is therefore going to do it properly. They had made their determination. She had passed some tests. She had not been given the specific criteria for which she was beginning to understand how most important tests worked. James came to the kitchen every morning and ate methodically and in silence, and on the first morning had said one word about the food. The word was good. Walt had told her afterward, with the gravity of a man imparting genuine information, that this constituted a significant endorsement and that she should not expect further elaboration. James Calloway expressed approval through the absence of complaint, and the absence of complaint in this kitchen had apparently been notable before her arrival. Clara appeared on the 4th afternoon. Eleanor was alone in the kitchen, the cowboys out on the range, and the house quiet, working through the slow middle hours of the day on preparations for the next morning, when she heard small footsteps on the porch and looked up to find a 6-year-old girl standing in the kitchen doorway holding a cloth doll with button eyes and yarn hair. Clara Calloway had her father's dark hair divided into 2 careful braids, and her father's gray eyes and nothing else of her father in her that was immediately visible. Because where James was made of angles and economy, this child was made of round cheeks and open assessment, and the particular directness of very young people who have not yet learned that asking what you want to know is considered impolite. "You're the new lady," Clara said. "I am. My name is Eleanor. You can call me Ellie if you like." Clara came into the kitchen and stood beside the work table and looked at Eleanor with those serious gray eyes. "Did you know my mama?" The question hit somewhere specific, the way certain simple questions do. "No, sweetheart. I didn't know her. I'm sorry. She died when I was born. Papa says she was beautiful and kind, and she would have loved me very much." A pause. "Can you teach me to make cinnamon rolls? Mrs. Hensley says my mama used to make them." I want to learn something she knew. Eleanor set down what she was doing and looked at this small, serious girl standing in her father's kitchen, asking for the only possible connection to a mother she had never met, and felt something open up in her chest that had been closed for a long time. "Come here," she said. "I'll show you." They spent the afternoon making cinnamon rolls, Clara standing on a chair beside Eleanor, her small hands in the flour, her tongue pressed to her upper lip in concentration. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and cinnamon and warm bread, and Eleanor taught her how to roll the dough thin and spread the filling and cut the rolls with thread so they held their shape, and Clara asked questions with the relentless curiosity of a child who has decided you are a reliable source of information and intends to use you accordingly. "Why does Papa never bake?" "Because baking requires patience and gentleness. Your father is better at things that require strength." "He's very strong," Clara said with considerable pride. "I noticed. But he's sad sometimes, even when he doesn't show it. I can tell because his eyes go far away." She pressed her small hands into the dough with serious effort. "Do your eyes go far away sometimes?" Eleanor considered the question as honestly as it deserved. "Sometimes," she said, "but less than they used to." That evening, when the cowboys had eaten and the kitchen was clean, and Clara had been taken to bed by a slightly less guarded version of James than the one who had hired Eleanor 3 days earlier, Eleanor was finishing the last of the dishes when James appeared in the kitchen doorway. Not to get anything, just there. He poured himself a cup of coffee, which was a reasonable explanation for the visit, and sat down at the work table, which was less reasonable and suggested the coffee was not actually the point. She wrung out the dishcloth and hung it to dry without comment. "My wife Sarah used to do that," he said after a moment. know what a person needed before they asked. Eleanor sat down across from him. Outside, the Wyoming night was large and still. How long were you married? 4 years. I met her in Denver when I was buying breeding stock. She was a school teacher. Something shifted in the quality of his voice when he said this, not softening exactly, but becoming more precise, the way a focus adjusts to bring a distant thing into clarity. She came out here without complaint, 2 winters before she said a word about the cold. Never asked me to be something I was not. She sounds like someone worth missing. Every day, he looked at the surface of his coffee. When the labor started, it was February, one of those storms that comes down from the north and makes the world disappear for 3 days. By the time I got through the snow to the doctor, it was over. Clara was alive. Sarah was not. He paused. I should have made different arrangements. Should have had someone closer. Should have anticipated. You could not have anticipated every February storm in Wyoming, Eleanor said quietly. I brought her here. She chose to come here. You said she came without complaint, which means she knew what she was agreeing to. The choice was hers as much as yours. The silence that followed this was the kind that happens when something has been said that the listener is not yet sure how to incorporate into their existing arrangement of the world. My mother made a choice too, Eleanor said, and then stopped, surprised at herself for saying it. James looked at her. She walked into Boston Harbor 6 months ago. I saw the signs. I was there in the house and I saw what was happening, and I was too buried in my own grief to do anything about it. She looked at her hands on the table. I spent a long time thinking that if I had been more present, more attentive, I could have stopped it. Could you have? No, Eleanor said. And saying it aloud to this particular person in this particular kitchen was different from saying it to herself in the dark. It had more weight, more finality, the kind that actually settles things rather than simply postponing them. When someone has made up their mind to leave, you cannot hold them by force of attention. I have had to accept that. I have been telling myself the same thing about Sarah for 7 years, James said. It has not quite taken yet. It takes longer than feels reasonable. Yes, he looked at her steadily. It does. They sat in that kitchen for another half hour in the kind of conversation that moves between words and silence, with equal comfort, and when Eleanor finally climbed the ladder to the bunkhouse loft that night, she lay in the dark and thought about the fact that she had told him about her mother, and that the telling had felt not like relief exactly, but like putting down something heavy that she had been carrying in one hand while trying to do everything else with the other. She did not sleep for long before the fire started. She smelled at first the particular sharpness of burning wood that is not supposed to be burning, and then she heard the horses, and then she was at the window, and there was no question about what she was seeing. The barn was on fire, the red-painted barn that had looked so prosperous and well-maintained when she had walked toward this place 6 days ago, and the fire was not small and new and possibly containable. It was in the walls and in the hay, and climbing the dry timber with the efficiency of something that has been given excellent conditions in which to work. From inside the barn came the sound that she would not be able to remove from her memory for a long time afterward. 6 horses still inside. The sound they made was a sound no living thing should have to make. She was down the ladder and out of the bunkhouse before she had consciously decided to move. The yard was already full of men, Walt organizing a bucket line from the water trough, with the practiced authority of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how much time they do not have. Eleanor took her place in the line without being asked and passed buckets, and the water on her hands was shockingly cold, and the heat from the barn was shockingly hot, and neither of these facts was particularly relevant because there were animals inside. James had already soaked his jacket in the water trough and wrapped it around his head. Walt grabbed his arm and said something sharp, and James shook him off and walked into the smoke and the heat and the burning. The next 3 minutes were the longest Eleanor had experienced since the first night in Hargrove's locked room. He came out once with 2 horses, handed them off, went back. Came out a second time with 1, went back. Came out a third time with 2 more. Went back. Eleanor's arms were burning with the effort of the bucket line, and her eyes were streaming from the smoke, and the man she had known for 6 days was somewhere inside a burning building, and the night was enormous and indifferent around all of it. He came out the 4th time with the last horse, a bay mare, who came out wild-eyed and screaming, and nearly took him down with her before two cowboys caught her halter. James staggered clear of the barn entrance and went to one knee by the water trough, coughing with a rawness that seemed to go all the way down. Eleanor was beside him before she had registered the decision to move, pressing a wet cloth against his face, and he took it without looking up and pressed it to his eyes. "Stupid," he said, his voice scraped down to something barely functional. "6 horses alive," Eleanor said. He looked up at her. His face was black with smoke, and his eyes were red and streaming, and he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said nothing, but what passed across his face in that moment was not something she could have described with precision, except to say that it was the expression of a person who was revising their understanding of something important. The barn was lost. They contained the fire and kept it from reaching the bunkhouse and the house and the outbuildings, and by the time the sky began to pale in the east, the structure was a smoking ruin, and 12 exhausted men were sitting or standing in the yard with blackened faces in the particular hollow quiet of people who have just finished fighting something and are not yet sure what to do with their hands. Walt found the evidence before the sun was fully up. The smell of lamp oil in the southwest corner, concentrated and intentional. Boot prints in the soft ground outside the small window on the western wall, a size and depth consistent with a large adult male. And on the ground near the prints, caught in a crack in the fence post, a brass coat button with an engraved pattern that Walt held up in the early light and looked at for a long moment before he said quietly that he recognized the pattern. It was from a coat he had seen before on a man named Buck who worked for Douglas Hargrove. James stood in the smoking ruins of his barn with the button in his hand and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Hargrove set the fire," she said. "And someone paid him too," James said. He looked at the button. 2 birds with 1 stone. Damage the ranch and send a message about what happens to people who shelter inconvenient witnesses. The cowboys around them were quiet, listening. James looked at each of them in turn, the deliberate gaze of a man taking an accounting. "I will not blame anyone who wants to leave," he said. "This situation has become more dangerous than what any of you signed on for." Nobody left. Not one man moved toward the bunkhouse or the corral or the road. Walt put his revolver back in its holster and said in the flat, conclusive tone of someone stating a geographic fact that he had worked for James Calloway for 12 years, through drought and blizzard and market collapses, and was not planning to stop because someone liked matches. The other men made various sounds and gestures that amounted to the same thing. James looked at all of them for a moment. His jaw worked briefly in the way of a man containing something he does not intend to express, and then he straightened and said they would start rebuilding in the morning, and that roundup would continue as planned, and that no one was to ride alone until further notice. Later, when the men had gone to clean up and rest, James found Eleanor standing at the edge of the ruins. He stood beside her without preamble. "You followed me into the bucket line," he said. "I passed water. That was all. You could have stayed safe." "Safe is relative," Eleanor said, "when the man who wants to harm you knows exactly where you are sleeping." James was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. It came out simply without decoration, which made it mean more than it would have otherwise. She looked at him. "You're welcome." They stood for another moment in the early morning light that was finding the smoke still rising from the ruins and making something almost beautiful of it, the way light will do even with wreckage, if the angle is right. Then James said he had something to tell her. "Reed sent a rider this morning while you were at the bucket line." He looked at the ruins rather than at her. "He went out to Hargrove's property yesterday. He dug up those graves." Eleanor said nothing. 3 women, all of them showing signs consistent with violent death. One identified so far as Mary Hargrove, Douglas's first wife. The other 2 matched the descriptions of women who were reported missing in 1882 and 1884. He paused. "One of the descriptions matches a woman named Anna Doyle, 24 years of age, originally from Boston." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the brass key. "Hargrove has gone," James said. "When Reed arrived, the property was empty. He took what he could carry and left. Warrants are out in 3 territories." He looked at her now. "He will be found. These things take time, but they end." And Aldrich, still in Cheyenne, still conducting his business, still behind 4 walls that will require more than a letter and a boot button to penetrate. James's voice did not change pitch or pace when he said this, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had. But we are moving toward him. Maggie is pulling pharmacy records. Reed is building a case. We have the letter. 60 days, Eleanor said. 53 now. She looked at him. Then we have 53 days to make sure he does not find a way to use them. Over the following 2 weeks, Broken Spur Ranch rebuilt itself around the work of the roundup, like a living thing adapting to a new condition. The cowboys rode out in the early mornings and returned in the evenings, and between those hours, Eleanor ran the kitchen with the focused efficiency of someone who has found in the particular demands of feeding 12 hungry men 3 times a day, a structure that keeps the mind from wandering into territory it is not yet equipped to handle. She learned the land through the stories the cowboys told at the table. The north pasture where the grass was thickest. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, the one James had named the ranch for. The high ground to the west where you could see 30 miles on a clear day, and the mountains looked close enough to reach in an afternoon and were in fact 3 days' ride. She learned James through what he did rather than what he said, which was apparently the primary medium through which he communicated. He worked from before dawn until after dark and expected the same of everyone around him without asking it explicitly, because the standard was visible in his example, and the example was sufficient. He made decisions quickly and stood behind them completely. He was fair in the specific way that certain people are fair, not by treating everyone identically, but by treating each situation according to what it actually required, which is considerably harder and considerably more effective. On the 12th evening after the barn fire, Eleanor was in the kitchen. Long past the others had retired, working through the accounts for the pantry supplies, when she heard the sound she had been half expecting and wholly dreading for 2 weeks. Movement outside the kitchen door. Not the regular sounds of the ranch settling. Something careful. Something trying not to be heard. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She set down her pencil and looked at the door and thought very clearly about where the knife block was and how quickly she could reach it and whether she would need to. The door opened. Douglas Hargrove stepped into her kitchen. He looked worse than she had last seen him. The pressed respectability was gone, replaced by the appearance of a man who had been sleeping rough and drinking to manage the anxiety of it. His coat was dirty at the collar, and his eyes had the flat, slightly too wide quality of someone operating at the outer edge of their own control. But he had a gun in his hand. "You destroyed me," he said. His voice was quiet in a way that was more frightening than volume would have been. "You went to the law. You brought the whole thing down." He looked at her with the expression she remembered from the wagon on the road from Omaha, the clinical assessment, but it was cracked now, fractured by something underneath it that was uglier and less contained. "I am going to make sure you cannot testify." Eleanor did not move. She thought about screaming. She thought about the knife block. She thought about the distance to the door and whether he was faster than she was. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and grabbed her by the arm, and she drove her elbow into his jaw with everything she had, which was enough to rock him back, but not enough to break his hold. And then the gun came up toward her, and she thought with a peculiar clarity that she had not come 1,000 miles and survived 3 weeks in a locked room to end in her own kitchen. The door behind Hargrove came open so fast it struck the wall. James Calloway crossed the kitchen in what seemed like a single continuous movement and took Hargrove by the collar and the gun arm simultaneously, and what followed was brief and decisive, and left Hargrove face down on the kitchen floor with James's knee in his back and James's hand pinning the gun arm at an angle that made its use not worth considering. "Done," James said. His voice was absolutely level. Hargrove was done. Walt was already in the doorway. Pete was behind him. Within 2 minutes, there were 5 men in the kitchen, and Douglas Hargrove was bound at the wrists with a rope Walt produced with the efficiency of a man who carries such things as a matter of course. James looked at Eleanor across the room. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her hand pressed flat against it, not because she needed the support, but because she needed to feel something solid and real against her palm. She met his eyes and gave him a small, deliberate nod. "Send for Reed," he said to Pete without looking away from Eleanor. "Tonight." Sheriff Reed arrived before midnight. He took one look at the bruising on Eleanor's arm and the man tied to the kitchen chair and said with the economy of someone who does not need to add flourishes to plain truth that this was 2 attempted murder charges on top of 3 murder convictions, and that he was going to take significant personal pleasure in making sure Douglas Hargrove never left a locked room again. As Reed's men led Hargrove out through the kitchen door, Hargrove turned and looked at Eleanor one final time. His face had gone past the cracked version of itself into something stripped entirely bare, and what was left was small and mean and cornered, and he said, "You will never be free of this, even if I hang. You will always be what you were in that room, you know that." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the three women in the ground behind his house. She thought about Anna Doyle. She thought about Thomas standing in the parlor at 2 in the morning saying he was tired of watching people get buried. "My name is Eleanor Marsh," she said. "I came here to cook for 12 cowboys. That is all I ever wanted from any of this, and I am still here." Hargrove was taken out the door, and the night closed behind him. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then Walt, from his position by the stove where he had been making coffee for no reason, except that he was the kind of man who made coffee when there was nothing else constructive to do, said in his plainest and most direct manner, "Well, I imagine that settles that particular problem." "Not entirely," James said. He looked at Eleanor. "There is still the other one." "Aldrich." 51 days, James said. Eleanor straightened away from the counter. She rolled her sleeve back down over her arm. She looked at James Calloway standing in her kitchen in the middle of the night, with his jaw set and his gray eyes clear, and she thought about a brass key in her pocket, and a letter in her dress, and a woman who had walked into the harbor with her pockets full of stones. "Then we have 51 days, she said. "We should not waste them." The morning after Douglas Hargrove was taken away in chains, Eleanor Marsh made breakfast for 12 cowboys, as though nothing particular had happened, because the cattle still needed rounding, and the men still needed feeding, and the world had a way of continuing its ordinary requirements, regardless of what extraordinary things had taken place the night before. She made biscuits and fried salt pork and scrambled 3 dozen eggs in the large cast-iron pan, and set everything on the long table and poured coffee into tin cups, and did all of this with the focused, methodical attention of someone who understands that the most reliable cure for the specific kind of trembling that follows a close encounter with valiance is to put your hands to work on something useful. Her arm ached where Hargrove had grabbed it. She did not mention this. Walt noticed because Walt noticed everything, and he set a tin of salve on the kitchen counter without comment sometime mid-morning, which was the most tactful thing Eleanor had seen a person do in several weeks, and she used it and put it back, and they never discussed it, which was the most tactful response she could think of in return. The roundup continued. The men rode out the gray early mornings and came back in the evening smelling of horse and dust and honest labor, and Eleanor fed them, and the days moved through their ordinary hours, and the work of Broken Spur Ranch went on around her like weather, like the creek running over its stones, like the hawk making its long circles against the enormous sky. 49 days remained before the trial. 47, 43. She had stopped counting in a deliberate way because deliberate counting was its own kind of fear, but the number lived in the back of her mind the way certain sounds live in a house present, whether you are listening for them or not. On the 19th day after Hargrove's arrest, Maggie Foster rode into the yard at Broken Spur in the late afternoon with her medical bag and a second bag that clinked when she set it down, and an expression that told Eleanor, before she said a single word, that what she had found in the pharmacy records was significant. They gathered in James's office, the four of them, James, Eleanor, Walt, and Maggie. The lamp was lit against the early dusk. Outside, the last of the roundup horses moved in the temporary corral where the men had put them while the new barn was being framed. Maggie set 2 documents on the desk. The first was a receipt from a pharmacy in Cedar Falls. Strychnine purchased in quantity signed for under the name Henry Marsh. Eleanor stared at it. "Same surname as you," Maggie said. "Different handwriting, entirely different first name, clearly not you. But the use of your surname was not accidental." She looked at Eleanor steadily. If we had not already had the Aldrich letter establishing his connection to this situation, an investigator encountering that receipt might have spent considerable time looking in the wrong direction. "He was building a contingency," James said. He was standing by the window with his arms folded, looking at the receipt, with the expression he wore when he was being most careful about what he showed. If things fell apart around him, he wanted a trail that led toward Eleanor before it led toward him. "It is consistent with how he operates," Maggie said. "He creates legal and documentary cover for everything. He does not act directly if he can act through instruments." She produced the second document. "This is from the pharmacy in Cheyenne, the same quantity signed by a different name. but the handwriting on both receipts is the same. Whoever signed both of these is the same person, and it is not Frederick Aldrich. He used an agent. Robert Finch, James said. They looked at him. Aldrich's personal clerk at First Cheyenne Bank. I have had dealings with the bank twice in the past 4 years, and both times Finch was present. Young man nervous around horses, carries a pocket watch. He checks more than necessary. James unfolded his arms and picked up the Cheyenne receipt and looked at the handwriting with the focused attention of someone comparing it against a memory. He handles all of Aldrich's private correspondence. If Aldrich needed something done that required someone else's name on a document, Finch would be the instrument. Eleanor thought about the word instrument. Hargrove had been an instrument. Finch was an instrument. Frederick Aldrich stood at the center of this particular arrangement and kept his own hands entirely clean, and that she was beginning to understand was the thing that made him genuinely dangerous in a way that Douglas Hargrove, with his forged contracts and his physical violence, had never quite managed to be. Hargrove had been a predator. Aldrich was a system. We need Finch to talk, Reed had said the night before when James had ridden to Cedar Falls to brief him on Maggie's findings. A letter is suggestive, pharmacy receipts with a false name or more. But to bring charges against a man like Aldrich, we need someone who was present, someone who received instructions directly. He will not talk willingly, Eleanor had said. No, Reed had agreed, which means we need to give him a reason. The plan was Eleanor's. She did not announce it as such. She simply laid it out in James's office on that 19th evening with the lamp burning and the four of them seated around the desk, and she laid it out with the precision of someone who has had considerable time in a locked room to develop skills in working with the resources that are actually available rather than the resources you would prefer. Aldrich wants the letter, she said. He has wanted it since before I arrived in Wyoming. He is not entirely certain I have it or that I understand what it means, but he suspects both. If we send him a message indicating that I am willing to negotiate, that I would consider returning the letter in exchange for a specific arrangement, he will not come himself. He will send Finch. She looked at the receipt with the false name on it. And when Finch comes, he will not be coming as a bank clerk on legitimate business. He will be coming as an agent conducting an unauthorized transaction on behalf of his employer. Which means whatever he says in front of witnesses about that transaction and who authorized it becomes evidence. The room was quiet for a moment. That is a considerable risk, James said. Less risk than waiting, Eleanor said. 32 days until the trial, James. Hargrove will hang for 3 murders, regardless of what we do about Aldrich. But Aldrich will walk away from this entire affair, and he will wait 6 months and approach you again about the water rights, and the next woman he uses as an instrument may not be as fortunate as I was. She had not meant to say that last part. It came out with more force than she intended because it was the thing she had been thinking about since Reed told her about Anna Doyle's identification, the specific way of being the one who had made it out when others had not. James looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Walt. Set it up, he said. The message went to Cheyenne through an intermediary at a cattle buyer James trusted, who was making the trip anyway. It was brief and careful. Miss Marsh, formerly of Boston, currently residing at Broken Spur Ranch, Wyoming, is in possession of a certain document and would consider a private arrangement for its return. Inquiries may be directed to the ranch. They waited 4 days. The trial of Douglas Hargrove fell on the second of those days, which was a Tuesday. It took place in the territorial courthouse at Cheyenne in a room that smelled of wood polish and old paper and the specific gravity of judgments being made. Thomas Hargrove testified first. He was 14 years old, and he walked to the witness stand without assistance and sat down and looked at his father across the courtroom with the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has finally found the place to set it down. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described the night his mother died. He described the 2 women who had come after her and the graves he had watched his father dig. He described Eleanor's arrival and the 3 weeks of her captivity and the night he had opened the door and told her to go east. When Hargrove's attorney rose to cross-examine, Thomas looked at him with those old steady eyes and said before the first question was asked, I was 8 years old when my mother died. I remember everything. You will not find a different version of events by asking me the same questions in different orders. The attorney sat down. Eleanor took the stand after the lunch recess. The courtroom was full. She had worn the black Victorian dress, the one she had arrived in repaired now, and cleaned because she had decided that morning that she would not dress to look like someone other than who she was. She had come from Boston in that dress. She would face this in that dress. Hargrove's attorney went for the obvious weakness: no family, no independent witnesses, no way to verify her account against his. "You are asking this court," he said, "to take the word of a woman with no standing in this community against a man who has lived and worked in this territory for 15 years. Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at the jury. "I am not asking you to take my word for anything," she said. "I am asking you to look at 3 graves with no names on them. I am asking you to read Dr. Foster's medical report, which describes injuries consistent with everything I have told you. I am asking you to hear the testimony of a 14-year-old boy who had everything to lose by telling you the truth and told it anyway." She paused. "I am not asking the court to trust me. I am asking the court to trust the evidence." The jury deliberated for 22 minutes. The verdict was guilty on all counts. When the foreman read it aloud, Eleanor did not feel triumph. She felt the specific, quiet grief of a justice that comes too late for the people who needed it most. She thought about Anna Doyle. She thought about Mary Hargrove. She thought about the third woman whose name they had not yet been able to find. She thought they deserved this room. They deserved to be the ones sitting here. Outside the courthouse, James stood beside her in the October sun and did not say anything because he understood that there was nothing adequate to say, and adequacy was the only standard he held himself to. 31 days, she said finally. "For Aldrich," he said. "For Aldrich," she agreed. On the 4th evening, a man arrived at Broken Spur on a rented horse, wearing the kind of suit that looked correct for a city but wrong for a cattle ranch, carrying a leather satchel and checking his pocket watch as he dismounted in the yard. Robert Finch was 28 years old, with the slightly compressed look of someone who had spent his entire professional life in rooms where the ceiling was too low and the expectations were too high. He had the nervous, rapid eyes of a man who is accustomed to being the least important person in any room he enters, which generally means he is very good at reading rooms and very bad at recognizing when a room has been specifically arranged around his arrival. Walt was at the barn. Pete was on the roof of the new barn frame, doing work that gave him a clear line of sight across the entire yard. Samuel was by the corral gate. They were all where they had been throughout every working day of the past 3 weeks, which was important because a man who has come to conduct a transaction he knows is questionable will be looking for signs that the situation is not what it appears to be. Everything appeared to be exactly what it appeared to be. Eleanor met him on the porch. "Miss Marsh," he said. He had a pleasant voice, professionally neutral. The voice of a man trained to make other people feel their business was in competent hands. "I represent certain interests that are eager to resolve this situation to everyone's mutual benefit." "Come inside," Eleanor said. "I'll make coffee." She brought him to the kitchen, which she had chosen deliberately because the kitchen was where she was most herself and most comfortable, and because comfort in a situation like this one belonged to the person whose home it was. She poured coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from him and waited. Finch opened the satchel. Inside was a paper envelope containing money, and beside it a second document, a deed of release which he explained would legally terminate any claim James Calloway might wish to make against First Cheyenne Bank or any of its officers in relation to the property matters under discussion. "My employer," Finch said carefully, "is prepared to offer a generous settlement in exchange for the return of certain correspondence that has come into your possession. The amount in this envelope represents his good faith." "And your employer's name," Eleanor said. "I represent certain interest," Finch repeated with the particular smoothness of a man reciting a line he has been taught. "Mr. Finch," Eleanor looked at him across the table with the green eyes that her mother had said could see through people. "You have driven from Cheyenne on a rented horse to deliver to Shiktum in an unsigned deed of release on behalf of someone whose name you are not authorized to say. That tells me 2 things. The first is that the person you work for is very careful. The second is that you are not in this moment being careful at all." Finch stopped. "Because this kitchen," Eleanor said, "has 3 walls and a door, and the door is currently occupied." Finch turned. James Calloway was standing in the kitchen doorway. Walt was behind him. Reed's deputy, a young man named Carter, who had ridden out from Cedar Falls that morning and spent the day in the hayloft reading a book, was beside Walt. Robert Finch looked at the three men in the doorway, and then looked at Eleanor, and then looked at the money on the table which had been placed there by his own hands, and the deed of release which bore the letterhead of First Cheyenne Bank, and then he looked at his pocket watch, which was not helpful. He talked for an hour and 40 minutes. He talked about the strychnine. He talked about the 5 ranches along Broken Creek that Aldrich had been targeting their names and the specific amounts of their mortgage obligations, all of which Aldrich had been monitoring through the bank records. It was his legal right to access. He talked about the instruction to use Eleanor's surname on the pharmacy receipt, which had been Aldrich's contingency in the event that the Marsh woman, as Finch called her, with the terminology of a man who has heard someone referred to in a certain way enough times that it becomes natural, became a legal problem requiring deflection. He talked about Hargrove and about why Aldrich had sent him to Broken Spur even after Hargrove's arrest. The letter, Finch explained, was the only remaining piece of evidence connecting Aldrich directly to the arrangement. With Hargrove facing 3 murder charges, Aldrich could not approach him. But the letter was still out there, and the letter was the thing. Mr. Aldrich made contact with Hargrove through a third party in the spring, Finch said. He was no longer looking at anyone in particular, his eyes on the middle distance of a man who has decided that full cooperation is the only remaining option, and is proceeding through it with the thoroughness of someone who intends to do it completely rather than partially. He knew that Hargrove had a particular history with women coming west by correspondence. He knew he was careful and had not been prosecuted. He paid him to intercept Miss Marsh specifically to prevent her from reaching Broken Spur Ranch and potentially discovering the contents of a letter Mr. Aldrich had written and subsequently regretted. The room was very quiet. He knew about Hargrove's history, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. Yes, ma'am. He knew that the women Hargrove intercepted did not generally leave. Finch was quiet for a moment. Yes, ma'am. The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence from any that had come before it in the story. It was the silence of a truth arriving at its full size, which is always larger than you expect it to be when you have been working toward it for a long time. Eleanor thought about Anna Doyle. She thought about Mary Hargrove and the unnamed woman and the 3 wooden crosses rotting in the ground. She thought about Frederick Aldrich in his office in Cheyenne, making entries in his careful ledgers, sending instructions through intermediaries, building the kind of respectability that functions as a wall between a man and the consequences of what he has chosen to do. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the brass key. Then she looked at Reed's deputy. Write all of it down, she said. Every word. Frederick Aldrich was in his office at First Cheyenne Bank when they arrived, which was where he was every weekday afternoon between 2 and 5, because methodical men keep regular hours, and regular hours are a kind of armor. The office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Cary Avenue, which was the kind of street where important men had their offices in Cheyenne in 1885. The furniture was heavy and dark and expensive. The carpet had come from somewhere that charged by the foot. On the walls were framed documents, degrees, and licenses, and the kind of civic commendations that accumulate around men who give enough money to the right organizations and attend enough of the right dinners. Reed had the warrants. He had Finch's signed statement. He had the pharmacy receipts, the ledger pages Finch had described and then produced from his memory, with the accuracy of a man who had been keeping a record of his own vulnerability for some time. And he had Eleanor Marsh's testimony formally sworn, and the letter that Aldrich had written to Hargrove in what he must have believed was a private arrangement between 2 men who shared an interest in making inconvenient things disappear. He also had James Calloway, which was not a legal document but was a considerable presence. 3 floors above Cary Avenue, Frederick Aldrich stood at his office window and watched the street below, with the careful attention of a man who has learned that trouble when it comes arrives on foot before it arrives in the newspapers. He had been burning papers since 6 that morning. The most important ones first, then the secondary documents, and finally the correspondence that could be explained away if necessary but was cleaner not to have. He was not afraid. Fear was for people who had not planned. He had been planning for contingencies since the moment he understood that Hargrove had been arrested and that the Marsh woman was still alive. There were 3 versions of how this could resolve, and he had prepared for each of them. What he had not prepared for was Eleanor Marsh walking through his office door. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Too many footsteps for a scheduled appointment. He turned from the window. The door opened. They came up the stairs and, through the outer office, past a secretary who began a sentence that ended when she saw their faces, and Reed opened Aldrich's office door without knocking. Frederick Aldrich looked up from his desk. He was 62 years old. He had the well-maintained appearance of a man who understands that physical presentation is a form of argument, silver-haired, well-dressed, with the kind of smooth, considered face that has been practiced in mirrors for decades. His eyes were a pale, almost colorless gray, and they moved over the group in the doorway with a rapid, precise assessment before settling on Eleanor. In the fraction of a second before his expression rearranged itself into something that was prepared to be reasonable and engaged, Eleanor saw what was actually there. He had not expected her to be alive, or rather he had come to expect over the weeks since Hargrove's arrest that she would not be a problem he would have to face directly. And now she was standing in his office doorway, and the particular cold settling of his features told her that he understood from this single fact that the situation had moved entirely beyond the range of what he could manage through documents and intermediaries and careful distance. He recovered quickly. "Sheriff, James, I was expecting that we might need to have a conversation at some point. Perhaps we could schedule something more formal than a surprise visit." "This is formal enough," Reed said. He set the warrants on the desk. "Frederick Aldrich, I have warrants for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to destroy property, and complicity in the unlawful detention of Eleanor Marsh. There are further charges under consideration pending additional review." He paused. "You have the right to say nothing and the right to have counsel present for any questioning." Aldrich looked at the warrants. He looked at them with the expression of someone reading a document they already know the contents of, confirming a particular terrible paragraph that they had hoped might have been edited out. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "You understand," he said, and his voice was the voice she had imagined when she first read his letter in the pantry cabinet at Hargrove Ranch, smooth and considered, and containing within its reasonableness a complete indifference to the human cost of what he had arranged. "That this is a business matter. The land along that creek is worth 10 times what any individual rancher can make from it in a decade. Consolidated properly with the water rights managed efficiently, it becomes a resource that benefits the entire region." "It benefits you," Eleanor said. "I am part of the region." "Anna Doyle was part of the region too," Eleanor said. "She came from Boston on a correspondence arrangement the way I did, and she ended up in a grave with no name on it because she was an inconvenient variable in your land acquisition strategy." Aldrich said nothing. His pale eyes were very still. "You knew what Hargrove did to women," Eleanor said. "You knew, and you used it. You paid him to take me, and you expected that I would not come out the other side. And the reason you expected that is because you knew what happened to the ones who came before." She kept her voice level because the steadiness mattered more in this moment than anything else. "You are going to stand trial for what you did. Robert Finch has already given a sworn statement describing your instructions in considerable detail. Your ledgers are going to be subpoenaed. Your pharmacy receipts are going to be entered into evidence. And I am going to be in that courtroom, and I am going to tell the jury exactly what I found in a locked pantry cabinet in the home of the man you paid to make me disappear." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment with those pale, calculating eyes. Then he reached toward the desk drawer. James Calloway was faster. He had been standing at the edge of the group throughout this exchange with the contained stillness of a man who has decided to let events proceed but has not for a moment stopped tracking them. And when Aldrich's hand moved toward the desk drawer, James crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped the drawer from opening with his hand flat against the front of it. They stood like that for a moment, James's hand on the drawer, Aldrich's hand against James's hand, and the space between them, carrying the specific weight of it, a confrontation between a man who has done terrible things through careful distance and a man who has never once in his life put distance between himself and anything he was responsible for. "Whatever is in there," James said quietly, "is not going to help you." Aldrich's hand moved away from the drawer. Reed stepped forward with the restraints. They found in the drawer not a weapon but a second set of ledgers, smaller than the official ones. Written in a hand that was meticulous and clear, the handwriting of someone who kept detailed records because detailed records were how they maintained control. These ledgers contained entries going back 4 years, documenting each ranch along Broken Creek, each mortgage payment, each delivery of strychnine, each communication with Hargrove. At the back of the second ledger were 3 pages in a different section labeled with initials rather than names. When Reed turned to those pages, he went very still. He looked at Eleanor. The 3 women, he said, at Hargrove's property. He kept records. Eleanor came forward and looked at the page. The entries were brief and clinical. Dates, initials, payment amounts. The first entry was from 7 years ago. The third entry, the most recent, had her initials, EM. Beside it, the date she had arrived in Omaha. And beside that, an amount paid to DH. And then a line left blank, because she had not followed the pattern. Eleanor looked at the blank line for a long time. She thought about everything that stood between her and becoming another entry on that page. A brass key in a pocket, a 14-year-old boy in a dark parlor, Ruth Hensley's borrowed dress, 6 miles of Wyoming grassland, and the particular stubbornness of a person who has decided they are not done yet. She turned the ledger so that it faced Reed fully. "That is sufficient evidence," she said. "It is," Reed said quietly. They took Frederick Aldrich down the stairs of his office building and out onto Cary Avenue in the afternoon light of a Cheyenne October, and the people on the street turned to look the way people turn to look at things they will be describing to others for years, and Aldrich walked between the deputies with the stiff contained bearing of a man who has not yet accepted that a wall he believed was permanent has been removed entirely. Eleanor watched him go. She had expected to feel something specific in this moment. Victory perhaps, or relief, or some version of the satisfaction that comes when a long effort arrives at its conclusion. What she actually felt was quieter and less defined than any of those things. It was the feeling of a weight being set down after you have carried it so long that you have forgotten what your hands feel like without it. James stood beside her on the sidewalk as the deputy's horses moved away down the street. "Is it enough?" she asked. She was not asking about the evidence. He understood what she was asking. For Hargrove, yes. For Aldrich, the trial will take time. But the case is made. He paused. And those 3 women will have their names in a courtroom record before it is over. Their families will know what happened. Eleanor thought about the tattered newspaper clipping in her carpet bag, the notice about Anna Doyle from the Boston Evening Transcript. She thought about the family in Boston who had waited for word and received only silence. "Then it is enough," she said. "Not everything, but enough." The weeks that followed were the quietest Eleanor had experienced since Boston, which was not a comparison she would have found comforting 3 months earlier, but which she found now to be unexpectedly so. The roundup finished. The cattle were driven to the railhead at Cheyenne and sold at prices that covered the ranch's debts and left a margin for the winter and the rebuilding. The new barn rose from its framing in the course of 2 weeks, the cowboys working on it in the hours between their other tasks with the particular investment of men who have watched something they care about burn and are determined not to watch it happen again. Thomas Hargrove came to Broken Spur once 3 weeks after his father was taken to the territorial prison. He came with Reverend Shaw, who was arranging for the boy to apprentice with a cabinet maker in Cedar Falls. He was taller than Eleanor remembered, or perhaps she had only seen him in shadows and bad light before. He stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, in his old eyes, and said very little. Before he left, Eleanor found him by the gate. She took the brass key from her pocket. She had been carrying it since Omaha, since the locked room, since the 2 nights walking east through Wyoming dark. She held it out to him. "This is a key to James's kitchen," she said. "He sent it to me before I arrived so I would know a place was waiting. He gave me 1 to carry through everything that happened, 1 to keep when it was over. I want you to have this one." She put it in his hand. "Wherever you are going, something is waiting for you too. I want you to know that." Thomas looked at the key for a long moment. He was 14 years old and he had the eyes of someone much older, and he closed his hand around the key with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands the weight of what is being given. "Thank you, Miss Marsh," he said. "Mrs. Calloway now," she said. "But yes." He rode away with Reverend Shaw towards Cedar Falls, and she stood at the gate and watched until the wagon disappeared over the first rise of ground, the same direction she had walked 6 months before heading the other way. She went back inside. The kitchen was warm. The nightmares came on certain nights. Eleanor had expected this and was not surprised by them. She had learned in the 3 weeks at Hargrove's property that the mind does not simply process extreme experiences and file them away in the orderly fashion you would prefer. It returns to them in the dark hours, replays certain moments, insists on their continued reality in ways that are exhausting and disorienting, and also she had come to understand entirely normal. The mind was trying to categorize something large. It required time. On the nights the nightmares came, she would lie still for a moment after waking and orient herself by sound. The horses in the new barn, the creek running somewhere in the eastern dark, the wind in the grass. These sounds were the sounds of Broken Spur Ranch, which was a real place which she was in, which was not the locked room. Then she would put her hand in the pocket of the flannel robe Ruth Hensley had pressed on her before she left Cedar Falls for the last time and feel the brass key, and after a moment the trembling would stop. Clara had made herself Eleanor's student companion and self-appointed moral support team. All three of these roles adopted without discussion and executed with the single-minded dedication of a 6-year-old who has decided she knows what she wants and sees no reason to be indirect about pursuing it. She appeared in the kitchen every morning with her rag doll and her serious gray eyes and an agenda of things she intended to learn that day, and Eleanor taught her what she asked and more besides. She taught her to make biscuits and bread and cinnamon rolls that filled the kitchen with the smell of what they both hoped had been Sarah Calloway's kitchen on good mornings. She taught her to read a recipe and understand what she was doing rather than simply following instructions mechanically. She taught her one afternoon when the light was coming through the east windows in a particular way, and Clara had asked a question about her mother that Eleanor could not answer directly, that some things cannot be known, but can be honored anyway, and that making the things someone loved is one form of honoring them. Clara had held this thought very carefully, the way children hold things they recognize are important, and then she had asked if they could make another batch of cinnamon rolls for when her father came in from the range. They did. When James came in that evening and Clara brought him the rolls with the particular performance of casualness that children employ when they are desperately invested in a response, he had looked at the rolls and then at Clara and then at Eleanor, and something had happened on his face that Eleanor had come to recognize as the face James Calloway made when he was feeling something he had not yet built the right words for. He ate 2 rolls. Then he picked Clara up and held her for a long moment with his chin on top of her head, and Eleanor turned to the sink and gave them the privacy of not being watched. One evening toward the end of October, when the temperature had dropped enough that the kitchen stove was the warmest room in the house, and the sky outside was the particular deep blue that Wyoming evenings produce in autumn, when the air is completely clear, James came to the kitchen after Clara was in bed and sat at the work table and said with the directness of a man who has decided to say something and sees no reason to delay it. "Your contract is up in 11 days. Eleanor was washing the last of the dinner dishes. She dried her hands on a cloth and turned around. "I know. Walt tells me you have been helping him with the account books, going over the winter feed projections. He asked me to look at the numbers. I noticed a discrepancy in the hay tallies." "There was a discrepancy," James confirmed. "There is now not a discrepancy." He looked at her. "Walt has been doing those books for 12 years. He noticed the discrepancy 8 months ago and has been trying to work out where it was every week since." "He is very good at the cattle and the management of men," Eleanor said. "The arithmetic gave him trouble." "The ranch has several areas where the arithmetic is giving us trouble," James said. He was choosing his words with the care of a man laying out an argument he wants to make correctly because the stakes of getting it wrong are significant. "The supply negotiations, the accounts with the Cedar Falls merchants, the projection work for the winter and the spring drive. These are things that require someone who is good with numbers and who understands how a ranch operates." "I have been here 3 months," Eleanor said. "You have been here 3 months," James agreed. "And in that time you have cooked for 12 men through a full roundup, managed the kitchen accounts, identified the weakness in our hay supply projections, found evidence that exposed a banker who was systematically destroying 5 ranches, survived 2 direct attempts to remove you from the situation, testified against a man who will spend the rest of his life in prison, and taught my daughter to make cinnamon rolls." He paused. "I am not saying this to flatter you." "I know," Eleanor said. "I am saying it because I want you to understand that what I am about to offer is not charitable. It is the offer of a man who has run a ranch for 12 years and knows the difference between someone who is temporary help and someone who is essential. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the first owl of the evening was doing its work against the dark. I am not good at this kind of conversation, James said. I am better at showing things than saying them, which is a limitation I am aware of and have not successfully addressed. He looked at the table. But I need to say this directly because you deserve to have it said directly and not left implied. He looked up. In the 7 years since Sarah died, I have run this ranch and raised Clara, and I have done it adequately, I think, and I have not asked for anything from anyone. Because asking requires trusting, and trusting requires believing that something given can also be taken away. And I have been very careful for a longer time about what I allow to matter to me. He held her gaze with those storm gray eyes that were not a storm. Right now were something else entirely, something quieter and more deliberate. You have somehow in 3 months and with no apparent effort become something that matters to me. And I would rather say that plainly and have you tell me it changes nothing than spend another 11 days pretending otherwise. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter and felt the full weight of the moment she was standing in. She had come west looking for honest work. That was what she had told herself, and what she had told James, and what she had told Ruth Hensley, and what she had told Sheriff Reed in the courtroom in Cheyenne, and every version of herself she had examined in every mirror she had passed in the past 3 months. Honest work. 2 months. $40. No other expectations. But she had carried a brass key for 3 weeks in a locked room because it had felt like a connection to somewhere that was already waiting for her. She had walked 6 miles rather than take Ruth's horse because she had needed to arrive under her own power. She had stayed after the contract was fulfilled because she had found, without looking for it, the particular thing that a person who has lived in a small, airless room and a locked one discovers they were always trying to reach. Not safety, not rescue, not someone else's version of her own life. Something that was hers. People who were hers. Ground that had become without announcement familiar. I am not Sarah, she said. I know. I mean that in the specific sense that I am not the person you grieve, and I am not going to try to be. I am Eleanor Marsh. I came here from Boston with a carpet bag and bad timing and more stubbornness than is probably useful, and that is what I am. She met his eyes. I am not a substitute for what you lost. I am a different thing entirely. I know that too, James said. That is precisely what I am asking for. Not a replacement, not a restoration of something that is gone. You. He let the word stand on its own for a moment. This specific, particular, inconvenient, and apparently indestructible person. Eleanor looked at him. There was something rising in her chest that was not quite any of the words she had for it. It was the feeling of a door opening in a room you did not know was sealed. Indestructible is strong, she said. Apparently indestructible, he corrected. I left room for uncertainty. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Eleanor Marsh laughed. Not the polite managed sound of a woman being careful in someone else's space, but a real one, the kind that comes up from somewhere genuine and catches you by surprise. And she put her hand over her mouth, and James looked at her with something in her face that she had not seen there before, something open and present and entirely unguarded. Yes, she said when she had recovered herself. Yes, James, I will stay. He stood up from the work table and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he put his hand against the side of her face, careful. As everything he did was careful, and she put her hand over his, and they stood like that in the kitchen at Broken Spur Ranch on an October evening, with the owl outside and the horses in the new barn, and Clara asleep upstairs, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the most sufficient thing she had felt in years. They were married in November, 6 weeks before Christmas, in a ceremony that took place on the porch of Broken Spur Ranch on a cold, clear afternoon, with the mountains visible at the western edge of the world, purple and permanent and indifferent in their grandeur. Reverend Shaw, who had driven out from Cedar Falls in a wagon that was not built for speed but arrived eventually at everything important, performed the ceremony. Walt stood beside James with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to go right and is determined not to make too much of it now that it has. Maggie Foster stood beside Eleanor and did make something of it because Maggie was not a woman who saw the point of understatement at significant moments. Clara stood between them in a new dress that Eleanor had made from fabric. Ruth Hensley had sent out from town, deep blue calico with white buttons, and held a small bouquet of the last late-season wildflowers she had collected from the South Meadow that morning, with the concentrated purposefulness of a child executing a ceremonial role she has been anticipating for weeks. The Cowboys attended in clean shirts. This was apparently as formal as any of them got, and it was formal enough. When Reverend Shaw asked Eleanor if she would take this man, she did not look at the Reverend. She looked at James, who was standing in front of her in the cold November air, with his dark eyes steady in the mountains behind him, and the child standing at his side who had asked if they were the same, she and Eleanor. And Eleanor had said, "Yes, sweetheart, we are the same in that way." She thought about her mother and the Stones. She thought about her father and the debt. She thought about Tremont Street and the hairpin in the lock, and the 2 days walking through the Wyoming dark, and Thomas in the parlor saying he was tired of watching people get buried. All of it had happened. None of it had been wasted. It had all led here to this porch, to this man, to this small girl in a blue dress, with her father's gray eyes and a fistful of late wildflowers, and a future that was going to be. Eleanor was absolutely certain more than whatever any of them could currently see. "I will," she said. When James kissed her, Clara threw the wildflowers into the air with maximum force, and the Cowboys made a sound that was collectively the sound of 12 men who have been waiting for something good to happen and are willing to acknowledge it now that it has. Walt did not make any sound at all, but his expression for the duration of it was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told he can set it down. The first winter came hard, as Wyoming winters do, arriving suddenly and without apology in late November, and settling in with the permanence of something that has no schedule to keep. 3 days in January, when the snow came so thick that the ranch disappeared from its own perspective, everything beyond 10 feet becoming white and undifferentiated. The world reduced to the sounds of animals and the heat of the stove and the small, perfect, ordinary details of being inside together. Eleanor learned the winter the way she had learned everything else here, directly and without the intermediary of instruction, by observing what the land required and providing it. She learned to layer against the cold in the specific way that keeps warmth in and allows work. She learned to read the sky in the mornings for what the day was planning. She learned that a Wyoming winter is not a thing to be endured so much as a thing to be inhabited, which is a different relationship entirely. James taught her to shoot methodically and without drama, in the way he taught everything he knew, by demonstrating it correctly and then watching her repeat it until she did not need to think about the mechanics anymore. She was a faster learner than he expected and a better shot than either of them anticipated. "You have a steady hand," he said the second afternoon. "I spent 3 weeks developing it," she said, and he looked at her for a moment and then nodded, because they both understood what she meant, and neither of them needed to add anything to it. Clara had them both entirely and completely. She had the specific social genius of a child who has spent her early years in the company, primarily of adults, and has learned through long observation exactly what each adult needs from her and exactly how to provide it. She brought James coffee without being asked and sat in his lap while he did the account books and fell asleep there, with the perfect trust of a small person who has never once had reason to doubt that the person holding her will keep her safe. She brought Eleanor wildflowers from the meadow and the drawings she made at school, and the news from the Henderson children, who were her closest neighbors in age, with the comprehensive reporting style of someone who understands that information is a form of connection. The nightmares came less frequently as December passed into January. By February, they were occasional rather than regular visitors, rather than residents. The brass key stayed in the pocket of Eleanor's robe. She was not ready to not have it there. Perhaps she never would be. She had decided that this was acceptable. On a morning in early March, with the snow still deep on the ground, but the light beginning to change in the particular way that announces spring is somewhere in the distance, even when all available evidence suggests otherwise, Eleanor sat down at James's desk after breakfast with the account books and the winter supply watch ledgers, and worked through the numbers for the spring drive with the focused pleasure of someone who finds that arithmetic has a comfort to it when the variables are ones you understand and trust. She was halfway through the feed cost projections when she noticed the small tin box in the bottom drawer of the desk. She had not looked in that drawer before. The box was plain, the kind used for storing documents or correspondence. She started to close the drawer, and then because she had learned in the past 6 months that small, plain boxes sometimes contain important things, she stopped. She looked at the box for a moment. Then she got up and found James in the barn. He was with two of the horses doing the slow, patient work of checking feet and legs after the winter months, the kind of maintenance that requires attention and cannot be hurried. He looked up when Eleanor appeared in the barn doorway. She held up the tin box. He was quiet for a moment. "Sarah's letters," he said. "She wrote to her family in Denver every week. After she died, her mother sent them back. Said she wanted me to have them." He looked at the box. "I have not opened it." "7 years," Eleanor said. "7 years." She looked at him across the barn in the cold winter light coming through the high windows. This man she had chosen and who had chosen her. This man who had sent a brass key ahead of himself as a way of saying someone is already waiting for you. She thought about what it cost a person to carry grief that had never been open, the specific weight of it, the way it shaped the space you moved through, without your being entirely aware of how much of the available room it was using. "Would you like to open it?" she asked. He looked at the box for a long moment. "Not alone," he said. She came into the barn and they sat on a clean hay bale, and James opened the tin box and they read Sarah Calloway's letters together in the cold winter light. Not all of them, not that day, but enough to understand that Sarah had been a woman who loved her husband and her life here, and had known Eleanor thought without surprise how to be exactly where she was. Neither of them spoke for a while when they finished. James put the letters back in the box carefully. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," Eleanor said. They sat in the barn for a little longer, not talking, listening to the horses, and then they went back inside. In April, when the snow was pulling back from the lower ground and the creek was running high with the winter's accumulated water, finding its way toward wherever water goes, Eleanor wrote a letter. She had been composing it in the back of her mind since the day Reed had told her that one of the three women in the graves behind Hargrove's house had been identified as Anna Doyle, 24 years old, from Boston. She had been constructing it in fragments late at night when Clara was sleeping, and James was doing the last account review of the day, and the house was quiet around her, and she had time for the thoughts that required time. She sat at the kitchen table on an April afternoon with the sun coming through the east windows that she had come to think of as her windows because they were the windows she had looked through every morning for 7 months and had grown to know in the specific way, a view that you have watched through all the conditions of a season. And she wrote the letter in one sitting, which surprised her because she had expected it to be harder. The family's address had come from the trial records. Reed had tracked them down as part of the identification process. Eleanor had asked for the address and he had given it without asking why, because he was the kind of man who understood that there are things that need to happen that do not have official categories. She wrote, "I did not know Anna. I arrived in Wyoming the same way she did, by letter, seeking honest work in a place where the debt and grief of my previous life could not follow me. I was intercepted in Omaha by the same man who intercepted her, and I was held in the same house, and I looked from the same window at the same unmarked ground. I do not know what happened to her specifically because no one will ever know exactly, and I am sorry for that because you deserve to know, and she deserved better than to be buried without a name. I am alive because a 14-year-old boy was braver than any adult in his situation could have been reasonably expected to be. I am alive because a man I had never met sent me a key before I arrived. I am alive because of decisions made by other people and by myself in moments that could have gone the other way, and I am aware of this every single day. Anna is not forgotten. Her name is in the trial records in Cheyenne now. She is part of the reason Frederick Aldrich, the man who arranged for both of our interceptions, will not spend another day conducting business from a free position. Her death and the deaths of the two other women buried beside her made possible the kind of case that a single surviving witness could not have made alone. I know this is not comfort. I know that nothing I can write to you is comfort. But I wanted you to know that she was here and that her being here mattered and that she is not going to be one of the people the world simply moves on from. With respect and sorrow, Eleanor Marsh Calloway, Broken Spur Ranch, Wyoming territory. She addressed the envelope carefully. She set it on the corner of the table to be taken to Cedar Falls with the next supply run. Then she sat for a moment in the kitchen with the April light coming through the east windows and the sound of Clara singing something tuneless and happy somewhere in the upper part of the house, and the sound of James crossing the yard outside with the decisive stride of a man who knows exactly where he is going. She put her hand in her pocket. The brass key was there, worn smooth along the bow from 7 months of being held. She took it out and looked at it in the morning light, lighter than it had any right to be for something that had carried so much. The key to a kitchen in Wyoming that a man had sent ahead of himself to a woman he had never met because he wanted her to know before she arrived that the place was already waiting for her, not as a stranger, as someone who belongs there. She closed her hand around it and felt the familiar weight of it which fit her palm the way it always had, the way a thing does when it has been carried long enough to become part of the shape of you. And she thought, here is the thing about keys. They are only useful if there is a door, and the door is only meaningful if there is something worth being inside. She had been inside this house for 7 months. She had cooked in this kitchen and sat at this table and slept upstairs in the room that looked out over the eastern fields where the light came first in the mornings. She had stood in this yard in the rain and in the snow and in the particular golden light of Wyoming afternoons when the whole world looks like something that was made to be looked at. She had sat in the barn with a tin box of letters and understood something about grief and forward motion that she had been working toward for longer than she had been in Wyoming. She had found the thing that honest work had always been pointing toward, which was not the $40 and not the 2 months and not the cooking for 12 cowboys, but this, a place where she was known, where the being known was not a liability, but a comfort, where the door was not locked and the key was in her own hand. She put the key back in her pocket. She got up and went to start the coffee. Outside, James's footsteps came up the porch steps, and Clara's voice came down the stairs asking if the rolls from yesterday were still in the kitchen. And somewhere to the east, the creek was running high and fast with the water of an ending winter. And the morning was beginning the way mornings do when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. She had arrived with 9 cents in a stranger's letter and no plan beyond the next step. She had found her ground. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.